In a Detroit electronics plant, the assembly lines are silent. Half-built circuit boards sit in neat rows, waiting for one thing they can't get: copper. The spools that once fed miles of wire into this factory are gone. In their place, empty reels and warning notices from suppliers. No Canadian copper until further notice. At a press conference in Washington, Donald Trump slams a stack of charts onto the podium. He points to a red line plunging off the graph, the 35% share of U.S. refined copper imports that came from Canada, worth $8.2 billion in 2024. "This is a disgrace," he says. "They're cutting us off and sending our copper to China and Europe." In British Columbia's sprawling open-pit mines, it's a different story. Excavators dig through rich ore, loading it onto trucks, bound for smelters working at full tilt. Piles of gleaming copper cathodes are stamped "Not for U.S. export" before being wrapped, loaded, and shipped not south to American buyers, but west to Shanghai and east to Hamburg under new multi-year contracts worth $9.5 billion. The shock to American industry is immediate. Copper prices on COMEX jump 18% in a month. Wire producers in Ohio furlough hundreds of workers. Electric vehicle assembly plants in Michigan push back launch dates. From skyscraper construction in New York to wind farm projects in Texas, the ripple effects are everywhere. This isn't because the U.S. can't use the copper. Not because the copper isn't there, but because Canada's new Strategic Metals Export Control Act shut the door, and the United States was left without a key to open it. How did it come to this? And why were China, the EU, and South Korea ready to take America's place overnight? This is the story of how the United States went from Canada's top copper customer to a shutout bystander, and how others took it all. For decades, the copper trade between the United States and Canada was one of the most stable, high-value commodity relationships in North America. The two countries shared not just a border, but deeply integrated mining, refining, and manufacturing supply chains. Canadian copper mines, concentrated in British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec, supplied a steady flow of refined copper and concentrates to U.S. smelters, wire producers, and electronics manufacturers. By 2024, Canada accounted for 35% of all U.S. refined copper imports worth $8.2 billion annually. This wasn't just about raw materials. That copper powered the backbone of U.S. industry: electrical grids, automotive manufacturing, high-tech electronics, and the rapidly expanding electric vehicle and renewable energy sectors. Historically, the trade ran like clockwork. Ore was mined in Canada, refined domestically, then moved south via rail or truck, clearing customs quickly under long-standing critical minerals agreements. The U.S. could rely on Canadian copper as a just-in-time feedstock, reducing the need for massive stockpiles. The 2020 U.S.-Canada Critical Minerals Agreement cemented this relationship, ensuring a stable, tariff-free flow of copper and other strategic resources. For American manufacturers, it was a safety net, a guarantee that one of the world's top-quality copper suppliers was always within reach. But in the years leading up to 2025, political and trade tensions began to erode that foundation. Disputes over U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum strained negotiations. Efforts to renew the Critical Minerals Agreement stalled. By early 2025, that once reliable copper pipeline was looking vulnerable. When Canada finally made its move cutting the U.S. off entirely, it wasn't just a policy shift. It was the collapse of decades of mutual dependence, leaving American industry scrambling for alternatives. The turning point came in April 2025 with the enforcement of Canada's Strategic Metals Export Control Act, a sweeping new policy that put refined copper, copper concentrates, and several other critical minerals under tight export controls. Under the law, only countries with an active bilateral critical minerals cooperation agreement could receive guaranteed access. The United States had once held that status, but its 2020 agreement expired at the end of 2024 without renewal. The failure to renew wasn't an accident. It followed a year of escalating trade disputes, particularly Washington's decision in mid-2024 to reimpose tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum. Ottawa saw that move as a breach of trust, and talks over critical minerals quickly soured. By the time the deadline came, there was no political appetite in Canada to sign a new deal without major concessions U.S. negotiators refused to make. The main cause of the collapse was therefore straightforward. Without a formal agreement, U.S. buyers no longer had preferred access to Canadian copper. Under the new law, export permits for U.S. companies were halted in April, and Canadian producers were told to prioritize allied supply chains, a phrase that now meant the European Union, China, and South Korea. Even before the act took effect, Canada had been laying the groundwork for new markets. In February 2025, Ottawa signed preliminary supply agreements with the EU under the Canada-EU Critical Minerals Partnership and with Beijing through the China-Canada Copper Cooperation MOU. By the time U.S. companies were officially cut off, multi-year deals worth $9.5 billion had already been inked, covering 500,000 metric tons of copper annually. The secondary causes only made the U.S. position worse. Canadian policymakers wanted to lock their copper into supply chains that supported the booming global demand for electric vehicles, wind turbines, and solar infrastructure sectors, where the EU and China are building aggressive capacity. Canada's refined copper also carries a lower carbon footprint, thanks to cleaner energy inputs in mining and smelting, making it especially attractive to ESG-conscious buyers. There was also a currency advantage. The Canadian dollar's stability against the Brazilian real, euro, and Chinese yuan gave buyers predictable pricing, while U.S. tariffs created volatility in other metal markets. Add to this Canada's highly efficient ports, Halifax, Vancouver, and Montreal, and a streamlined customs process for priority minerals, and the logistical case for diversion away from the U.S. was airtight. By May 2025, the first copper shipments under the new contracts were steaming toward Shanghai and Hamburg, bypassing traditional U.S. buyers entirely. American manufacturers were left scrambling to source from Chile, Peru, and the DRC, all with longer shipping times, higher prices, and less predictable delivery. The policy decision in Ottawa may have been framed as a strategic realignment, but for the United States, it felt like a lockout. And while Washington debated how to respond, Canada's new partners wasted no time cementing their advantage. When Canada closed the door on U.S. copper buyers, it opened a far wider one to the rest of the world. The winners, China, the European Union, and South Korea didn't just step in. They locked themselves into long-term positions that could shape the global copper market for a decade. The European Union moved first. Negotiators in Brussels had been tracking Canada's export policy review since January 2025. By February, the Canada-EU Critical Minerals Partnership was expanded to include refined copper and concentrates, guaranteeing zero export quotas and stable pricing for at least 5 years. Germany's industrial sector, from automotive giants in Stuttgart to wind turbine manufacturers along the North Sea, hailed the deal as a breakthrough. Spain's cable manufacturers quickly followed, with multi-year purchase agreements, ensuring a steady supply for both domestic projects and re-export within Europe. China secured its position through the China-Canada Copper Cooperation MOU, signed just weeks before the U.S. ban took effect. The agreement included an option for yuan-denominated settlements, insulating both sides from dollar volatility. For Beijing, this was a strategic win. Copper is essential to its vast urban infrastructure projects, EV rollout, and Belt and Road energy investments. Canadian copper cathodes, prized for their purity and ESG-friendly mining credentials, became a premium feedstock for Chinese smelters and manufacturers. South Korea, though smaller in volume, made its own decisive move. As a leading producer of high-end electronics and electric vehicle batteries, Seoul signed contracts with Canadian suppliers to feed its rapidly growing renewable energy infrastructure. Its government framed the deal as part of a national strategy to secure stable inputs for green industries, reducing dependence on imports from politically unstable regions. Canada's ability to execute these deals so quickly was no accident. Its mining sector is deeply integrated with global green technology supply chains, and its ports from Halifax in the east to Vancouver in the west are optimized for bulk mineral exports. Copper leaving Canadian shores under these new contracts often moves directly into just-in-time manufacturing networks overseas, minimizing storage costs and maximizing efficiency. The environmental angle was another decisive factor. With a lower carbon footprint per ton of copper produced thanks to hydroelectric-powered smelting and stringent environmental regulations, Canada's exports carried a built-in marketing advantage for ESG-focused buyers. For the EU, which has strict carbon border adjustment mechanisms coming into force, this was not just a preference, it was a compliance requirement. Meanwhile, Canadian miners and refiners ramped up production schedules. New shifts were added. Equipment orders were placed for expansion. The industry's message was clear: the U.S. market could be replaced, and it was being replaced right now. By the end of Q2 2025, 500,000 metric tons of Canadian copper, once destined for the U.S., was already tied up in foreign contracts. For China, the EU, and South Korea, this was not a temporary windfall. It was the foundation for a long-term strategic advantage. For the United States, it was a reminder that in global commodities, loyalty follows opportunity, not history. The impact on the United States was swift, visible, and painful. Industries that had long taken for granted a steady flow of Canadian copper suddenly found themselves facing supply gaps that couldn't be filled overnight. In Michigan, an electric vehicle assembly plant that had been preparing to launch a new model was forced to delay production by 3 months. Without enough copper wiring for motors and battery systems, hundreds of workers were sent home on partial pay. The delay rippled through the supply chain. Parts suppliers in Ohio and Indiana slowed their own operations, while marketing campaigns were put on hold. In Ohio, a wire manufacturing facility shut down 2 of its 4 production lines. The plant's general manager stood on the factory floor, looking at empty storage bays where neatly stacked copper cathodes used to sit. "We can source from Chile or Peru," he said, "but the lead times are longer, the costs are higher, and the quality isn't always consistent. This isn't just a price problem, it's a reliability problem." COMEX copper prices jumped 18% in a single month, adding cost pressure across construction, electronics, and renewable energy sectors. In New York City, skyscraper projects saw budgets balloon as wiring and plumbing materials surged in price. Wind farm developments in Texas had to renegotiate contracts with turbine manufacturers, as copper cabling costs exceeded original estimates. The social toll is hitting smaller communities hardest. In towns near U.S. smelters that relied on Canadian feedstock, layoffs are piling up. Cafes and diners that served plant workers have fewer customers. Equipment suppliers are cutting back orders, leaving their own staff underemployed. In some cases, families tied to the copper industry for generations are putting homes on the market, unsure if their communities have a future without those steady jobs. Even sectors that still have copper are feeling the squeeze. Higher prices mean smaller profit margins, forcing companies to choose between passing costs on to consumers or absorbing the hit. For many, it's a lose-lose calculation. What's most troubling for U.S. industry leaders isn't just the current shortage, it's the prospect that this could be permanent. Canada's new contracts with the EU, China, and South Korea run for years, not months. Unless Washington can negotiate a way back into the supply chain, American manufacturers may find themselves permanently downgraded to secondary buyer status in a market they once dominated. In global commodities, trust isn't just about honesty, it's about predictability. For decades, the United States assumed its proximity and deep economic ties with Canada guaranteed access to critical resources like copper. Buyers on both sides of the border operated on the belief that supply flows were as secure as the pipelines carrying oil. That belief collapsed in April 2025, when Canada enforced the Strategic Metals Export Control Act and excluded the U.S. from its list of preferred partners. It signaled something deeper than a policy shift. It told the world that even the closest trade relationships could fracture if political disputes go unresolved. For foreign buyers in China, the EU, and South Korea, this reinforced a principle they already operate by: reliability is worth paying for. Canada didn't just offer high-grade copper, it offered certainty. Multi-year contracts, stable pricing, low-carbon production, and no risk of sudden policy reversals. That's why they were ready to sign before the ink on the U.S. ban was dry. In contrast, U.S. buyers were left scrambling because they had assumed access was a given. The lapse of the U.S.-Canada Critical Minerals Agreement in 2024 didn't just remove a piece of paper, it removed the legal framework guaranteeing priority treatment. Without it, American companies became just another buyer in the open market and not the preferred one. International supply chains are built on planning years in advance. When a country proves it can't guarantee long-term stability, buyers begin designing alternatives, and once those alternatives are locked in, switching back is costly and disruptive. The copper cutoff has made one thing clear. In the high-stakes world of strategic resources, reliability is a competitive advantage. And right now, Canada has it, the United States doesn't. In just a few months, the United States went from securing over a third of its refined copper from Canada to watching those shipments vanish completely. The gap was filled instantly, not by new U.S. sources, but by China, the European Union, and South Korea, all signing multi-year contracts that locked in hundreds of thousands of tons of Canadian copper for years to come. The lesson is harsh but simple. In global trade, it's not enough to have the closest port, the deepest history, or even the biggest market. You need to be the most reliable partner politically, economically and logistically. The US lost that status, and Canada's other customers seized the moment. Copper isn't just another commodity. It's the wiring in electric vehicles, the veins of renewable energy systems, the lifeblood of modern infrastructure. Without stable supply, production slows, costs rise, and opportunities slip away. Once those opportunities are gone, they rarely come back without a fight. If Washington wants to reclaim this market, it will need more than emergency deals and quick fixes. It will take rebuilding trust, securing long-term agreements, and ensuring policy stability that international partners can depend on. The real question is, can the United States repair the damage before these new supply lines become permanent? Or has the Canadian copper market been lost for good? Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you want to be first to know when the next big shift hits the global economy, make sure you're subscribed.